Hi, everybody. Welcome to part two of our special video lecture on the Nation State Project. This is material we would have covered in class, but which you can now watch in the comfort of your own dwelling as a video lecture. We were talking about the Nation State Project, which means, on the one hand, the way that the United States became, in effect, a truly independent governing state following the American Revolution, but also then how the story was told of that developing nation state. That is, how do you create a narrative that somehow encompasses the history on the ground and or the mythologizing of that history in what we usually refer to in class as the SVH, which has a significant amount of that mythologizing element in it. And a good example of that is how in the SVH, typically this period of expansion in the early 1800s, what's called the early Republic era of the US, is often framed as the expansion of democracy. That is, as the continuing freedom story, an expansion of democracy where settler folk who migrated from the East began to take up lands now in the West, what was then the West, the Ohio Valley, Mississippi Valley, under the rubric of common man democracy. The great image or emblem of that democracy, as we said last time, was Andrew Jackson, himself a frontier settler who becomes integral in the expansion of that early West. And though he is depicted in the SVH as the exemplar of common man democracy, Jackson is undeniably also an agent in the settler colonial counterinsurgency warfare model of expansion that drove the U.S. into those new Western lands. We should also say about this model of democracy that it had a very specific racial component. From the beginning, the nation and the nation-state project reflected that racial bias, we might say, very explicitly. This is not something that was hidden, not something that we've had to sort of formulate somehow, out of thin air in retrospect. They weren't embarrassed about it. And so when they talked in terms of a racial democracy, they saw themselves as protecting the interests of what was essentially a white, English-speaking Christian constituency. Take a look here at one of Jackson's statements. Andrew Jackson, as president, will become rather famous for his Indian removal policies, which will seek to remove the native peoples from those southeastern lands into what would be defined as the frontier trans-Mississippi southwestern lands. We'll get to that here in a bit. But listen to the statement by Jackson referring to Native America. He said, "What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities, towns, and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion." So that's a fairly standard template, you might say, for what will become the manifest destiny narrative of American expansion. A certain model of civilization occupied by a certain racial demographic of people, all of which under the aegis of a growing market revolution that creates towns and commerce and such. We'll talk more about that as we go along. That model of civilization comes to be promoted by individuals like Jackson and many others as the essential model now, not only of what's called Jacksonian Democracy, but also then in the SVH, the basic story of the nation. As I say, the man for whom the era is named won his reputation first as an Indian fighter. General Andrew Jackson of Tennessee. He was born in North Carolina, on what was then the frontier of North Carolina before the American Revolution. He grew up to be, by turns, a landowner, a slave owner, a politician, and most famously, a military figure in the campaigns of counterinsurgency warfare against the native peoples in that western region. In his case, it was the Muskogee Confederacy, the great native ruling entity of the southeastern lands that Jackson set his sights on, you might say. According to Pekka Hamalainen, the historian, in his book Indigenous Continent, Jackson mobilized an army of nearly 3,000 U.S. troops and hundreds of Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw native soldiers and descended on the Muskegees, killing almost 1,500 in a genocidal campaign that culminated in an attack at Horseshoe Bend in the Mississippi Territory, in which more than 800 Muskogees died. In the ensuing 1814 and 1816 treaties with the United States, the Muskogees, having lost nearly 2,000 soldiers, surrendered more than 40,000 square miles, a massive L-shaped swath of land in the very heart of the indigenous South, foreshadowing the Southern Indian removals to come. You'll recall we mentioned the Muskegee when we were talking about colonial history, particularly the colonial history of South Carolina, and how at that time in the early 1700s, the Muskogee really were the ruling native interests throughout the lands that would become Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. That is, the whole swath of that country stretching out toward the Mississippi River. And the Muskogee would come to be the target for Jackson's military campaigns, as Andrew Jackson and many others in the white English-speaking nation coveted those lands for their fertile soils and what would, as we'll see, become the expansion of the Cotton Kingdom, that is, the slave labor dependent Cotton Kingdom of the Deep South. And so it was through a series of campaigns employing, again, insurgent fighters, some regular military. Jackson himself is given a commission in the U.S. Army, having emerged from the militia ranks, but many of his soldiers will remain what we call irregulars, that is, counterinsurgency fighters drawn from the militias stretching from Kentucky to Georgia to the unclaimed territorial states in the deeper South, states that would become eventually Alabama and Mississippi, for example. Jackson made his fame also as the hero of New Orleans during the War of 1812, in which his coalition of forces defeat a British army at the end of that war, and giving rise to Jackson's fame and ultimately to his political potential as president of the United States, the hero of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson. He's shown here in this image meeting with one of the Muskogee tribal leaders at the time of the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Jackson's policy regarding Indian removal as president, he's elected in 1828, shows, I guess, what we might call the limits of Jacksonian democracy. According to Secretary of War John Eaton, the president views the Indians as the children of the government. He sees what is best for them, and that a perseverance in their refusal to fly the dangers that surround them must result in their misery and final destruction. And here is an image showing Jackson with what look like doll-sized native people, suggesting what Eaton called that sort of paternal or patriarchal visage of Jackson as the great white father, you might say, of the native peoples, the ruling chief of the United States, and the man who would be responsible as the architect of Indian removal for forcing those native peoples out of the southeastern lands into tribal, especially designated tribal areas west of the Mississippi, basically what is now the state of Oklahoma. It's worth saying, I think, that what we're seeing here is the beginnings of modern political propaganda. The printing press, advances in the printing press in particular, and in printing images, graphic images, printed texts, books, pamphlets, you name it, became caught up in the politics of the age, and the first modern political campaigns, which sought to put forward candidates who were in one way or another associated with the fortunes of American expansion, with this racialized democracy that I'm describing, often in that kind of patriarchal mode of the father. We said that the U.S. National Project had from the beginning that filial pietism, right? That worship of fathers that was grounded in a mythology of founding fathers with all its biblical overtones and ancient Roman overtones. It makes for good marketing. You know, it rouses political support and gives identifiable face to, the politics of the age. Despite the efforts of some tribal states to become quote unquote civilized, it seems that Jackson was pretty determined that all native peoples be removed. By 1830, the Cherokees, who had occupied lands in Georgia and Tennessee and along the Blue Ridge Mountains, long an established power in that region, the Cherokees had attempted to adopt many elements of white American society, such as the creation of formal government with their own bicameral legislature, a court system, even a written constitution modeled on the U.S. Constitution. It was a Cherokee member, Sequoyah, who invented an 86-character written alphabet that made it possible to transcribe the Cherokee language. The Cherokees published their own newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, written in English, along with their alphabet. So despite these efforts to assimilate in large measure to the model, civilization model of the United States, in the end, the Cherokee were not spared any more than the other tribal states, including the Muskogee peoples, the Choctaw, and the Chickasaw peoples, including the Seminole peoples of Florida, were not spared the Edict of Jackson to remove themselves from those lands. They faced repeated battles with the state of Georgia, for example, debating their autonomy. It was a missionary, a white missionary by the name of Samuel Austin Worcester, who was arrested and imprisoned when helping Cherokees fight a series of discriminatory laws in Georgia. Eventually, these legal conflicts come to the Supreme Court in 1831 in a case called Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. The Supreme Court ruled that Indian tribes did not have the right to appeal to the Supreme Court, so essentially excluding them in fair measure from the sovereignty of the United States, making it very difficult. But the following year, in a case called Worcester versus Georgia, concerning the arrest of Samuel Worcester and another missionary living among the Cherokee, an arrest by the state of Georgia, who objected to their fomenting the Cherokee in legal opposition to expansion of the United States and claims Georgia itself had on Western lands, the court ruled that Georgia had no right to rule in Cherokee territory. So an interesting counterpoint, 1 year after the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia decision, which seemed to bar Cherokee from the sovereign entitlements of the U.S., the very next year, in another case, the Supreme Court ruled that at the same time, Georgia did not have the right to govern for the Cherokee. Jackson's response to all this was to forge on ahead with expansion plans and to, in effect, undermine Cherokee tribal unity by pitting different factions within the Cherokee Nation against one another. The victory which the Cherokee felt following the Worcester versus Georgia case faded pretty quickly. Jackson was undeterred. When he heard the verdict, he responded, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." John Marshall being the Chief Justice at that time of the Supreme Court. So in effect, you have a president who just flatly refuses to honor the checks and balances of the constitutional system, and using his own executive and military authority pushes on with his Indian removal plans. This map here shows the outcome of Jackson's Indian removal between 1830 and 1838, all the so-called civilized tribes. And they were called civilized simply because they had, at one time or another, agreed to assimilate in some measure to the demands of white government. Nevertheless, the civilized tribes, which included, as I say, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminoles of Florida, and the Muskogee, who the whites called the Creek Nation, forcing them, using military force now and counterinsurgency warfare, just as we saw in the Ohio Valley, to force these people west of the Mississippi, and in effect leaving those lands to be annexed by the United States. As Cherokee leaders continued to protest U.S. government action, it did not, in the end, prevent their removal. One of the protests what the Cherokee people had issued read that for the purpose of showing what glaring oppressions and sufferings the peaceful and unoffending Cherokees have been doomed to witness and endure, their devoted attachment to their native country has not been, nor ever can be, eradicated from their breasts. So the Cherokee people, standing strong as best they could in light of the expansion of this U.S. nation with its legal machinery, its political will, and its military, perhaps most importantly, its military moves, standing tall, but nevertheless ultimately forced in what we call the Indian removal of the 1830s. And the resulting removal of the remaining tribes, of course, remembered in history as the Trail of Tears because of the forced march of civilians, native peoples now, old and young, men and women, across those southeastern lands, eventually across the Mississippi River into what was a specially designated Indian Territory of the West, what would become later the state of Oklahoma. An estimated 18,000 men, women, and children were removed from their homes and led on a forced march in the years 1838, 1839 to the Indian Territory. Nearly a fourth of the Cherokees died along the way from exposure, malnutrition, illness. This was a brutal experience, as the name suggests, but one that was carried out with determination then, beginning in the administration of Andrew Jackson and following his presidency by his successor, Martin Van Buren. So, yeah, a central part then of the nation-state project as it affects the territorial ambitions, the settler colonialism, the counterinsurgency warfare, mythologized under the rubric of Jacksonian democracy, a racialized form of self-government that would see the indigenous peoples, the native peoples who had for really countless generations lived in these lands, lived and farmed and hunted and self-governed in these lands, see them removed now as a refugee population across the expanse of the southeastern territory. Similar tactics of pressure and manipulation ultimately led to the removal of thousands of other native peoples. Though not remembered much today, the United States would wage 3 separate wars called the Seminole Wars, fought mostly in Florida by the U.S. beginning in 1816 to 1858. Sometimes we say the war in Afghanistan is America's longest war, stretching almost 20 years or so. This war lasted nearly 40 years, some 42 years from 1816 to 1858. But it suggests, I think, the selective memory of the nation, that the Seminole Wars are not remembered as foreign wars, even though they were fought in a territory that originally did not belong to the United States. A Seminole leader by the name of Osceola led a long resistance to U.S. troops, often successful resistance, for years before he was captured in 1837. Eventually, most of Osceola's followers agreed under duress to move west, and the whole episode reinforced white Americans' racial definition of manhood and democracy in the age of Jackson. I say definitions of manhood and democracy because there was also an undeniable element here of what we might call testosterone fueled masculine ideals, that is, fighting in counterinsurgency units, so called rangers, local militia figures who often, as cavalry units, would wade into the violence of these counterinsurgency campaigns, killing civilians, burning villages and towns, destroying food crops and hunting grounds into what would then be the space into which white settlers could continue to first claim land, purchase land from land companies, and then occupy it as citizens of the United States. So, yeah, this is the basic model that really drives the nation-state project throughout the first several decades, leaving a legacy of what we might call settler memory and the questioning of our own public narratives. You see a statue here. I told you I had something near to my home, just a few blocks from where I live in San Jose, this Thomas Fallon statue. Fallon was part of the U.S. military's reconnaissance of the Greater West. Think of that nation-state project now extended all the way to California in the 1840s. Fallon was what was then part of Mexico. Fallon was part of the U.S. military's reconnaissance of that Greater West and participated in the U.S. annexation of California from Mexico following the Mexican War between the United States and Mexico in the 1840s. It was Thomas Fallon who was part of one of these sort of military units raised, made up often of irregulars, that is not professional troops, but militia troops, raised the American flag in San Jose in 1846. A scene depicted in this statue here, that figure in front on horseback is meant to be Thomas Fallon. You can't quite see it behind the horse's head, but he's holding a flag rather near the spot where it was said that Fallon raised the U.S. flag to claim San Jose as part of the new national territorial holdings, which in 1850 then would be admitted as the state of California, the state which we live in today. Settler memory. I want to spend just a second here defining that. In the words of historian Kevin Brunel, settler memory is the slow disappearance of indigenous peoples, we might say, in the memory of the conquering nation of the United States, the slow disappearance of indigenous peoples in the storytelling and memory, particularly of the what we might call the violence against them, which in the storytelling is first posited as critical to the origin of this origin story. In other words, that's where the Western stories always seem to begin in settler memory, is with some great conflict and some overcoming of that conflict, what we called earlier in the semester dominion, the establishing of dominion over native peoples. And by the end of the tale is but a trace embedded within it. So yes, settler memory, a pattern of storytelling, of remembering and forgetting, using native peoples as a kind of prop, you might say, in the storytelling origins of the nation, but then pretty quickly following conquest and dominion, removing them from the story. It's worth saying, as Kevin Brunel would remind, that those native peoples weren't in fact extirpated, as Secretary of State or Secretary of War Henry Knox put it, nor were they exterminated. It was popular in the late 19th century for narratives to speak of the vanishing natives, but they were not ultimately removed from from the landscape. The native peoples and their descendants living today in San Jose, the Ohlone peoples, very much a part of a burgeoning Native American rememory, you might say, or restoriation of that narrative. Now, as it turns out, protests over the years against the Thomas Fallon statue as a emblem of settler memory ultimately resulted in enough political pressure that the city government of San Jose decided to remove the statue. You see here from the San Jose Mercury News, infamous San Jose statue of Thomas Fallon is taken down. This is part of what has been a larger, as you know, effort to target certain memorials, certain statues, which its critics claim represent that sort of settler memory, that SVH mythologizing of conquest and dominion here in San Jose, the Thomas Fallon statue. And as I drove to work the other morning, I captured this image in place of where the statue used to stand. So what we might say is a kind of reverse settler memory, I suppose. Instead of the native peoples representing conflict, representing a barrier to U.S. civilization being ultimately taken out of the story, in this case, it's the settler memory itself that is physically taken down in the case of the Thomas Fallon statue. I'm a native of San Jose. I'm a fourth generation San Josean, you might say, Anglo-San Josean. My grandmother was born in San Jose. Her home where she was born still exists down on 10th Street. And so as a part of a legacy, you might say, of settler memory, I understand as a historian that things like statues and monuments don't represent so much history in some ultimate sense. It's often said by defenders of these statues that taking them down is akin to removing history. Well, we might think of these statues as a kind of editorial comment on somebody's version of the past, in this case of a settler memory version of the past. It doesn't represent anymore the story, say, of the native peoples from their perspective, but it does represent a kind of editorializing in the SVH tradition, of all how things went. And so what it reminds us of is that history is ultimately, a series of competing narratives, a way of telling stories from different perspectives, different vantage points at different times by different generations. We might like to think of history as being static, the thing, once it happens, never changes. But that's a naive view because history is always in flux. Keep in mind the Thomas Fallon statue itself was not some artifact from the founding of San Jose in the 1840s. It was erected in 1988, so very recently, again, as a kind of heritage comment by those who wanted to extol the heritage of white settler, Anglo-settler colonialism in Northern California. So, yeah, I think we get in trouble when we see these monuments, these memorials, these statues, these books, these narratives as the unchanging ultimate histories of the past. What they are efforts from a perspective to editorialize on that past and to raise the claims of certain groups above others. But that is a dialogue that will never end. As long as the storytelling animal, what we often call ourselves, the storytelling animal, is around to tell stories, the one thing we can bet on for sure is that the stories we tell will reflect the needs of the generations that tell them. All right, that's it for now. Thanks for taking a look. I will be back in class with you guys next week and continue on in our storytelling of the United States.